Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hawke. My guest today is Professor Donald Rayfield, and Donald is Emeritus Professor of Russian and Georgian History at Queen Mary University of London. One thing that's interested me for a while now is the question of how prisoners of war are treated, and it's varied so widely at different times and places. So when I came across a piece by Donald about prisoners in the Crimean War, I couldn't wait to get him on the show. So that's our subject today, prisoners in the Crimean War. But when I was preparing for this, I began to look at more of Donald's work on the history of Russia and the Caucasus, and I realised there was much more we could talk about. So the plan is this. Today's episode is going to be the first of three, and each episode will be pretty much self-contained. So today we're going to be focusing on the Crimean War itself and what happened to the men who were taken prisoner. And then the later episodes will go into the history of the Crimea more widely. Anyway, welcome, Donald, to the podcast.
Thank you.
So to make sure listeners have their bearings, can you just remind us when the Crimean War was fought and who was involved? And not just that, but why it was fought at all? And I must admit, I'm slightly nervous about the why it was fought bit, because I sort of feel that could be a whole podcast. So maybe we just have the headline version there.
The Crimean War, as we now know it, began in 1853 in spring, and it finally ended completely 3 years later in 1856 with the Treaty of Paris. And originally it wasn't a Crimean War. It was a war of Russia against the Ottoman Empire, against Turkey, part of its 100-year struggle to get Turkey out of Europe, a Russian project. It started by trying to retrieve the Christian provinces, which are today's Romania, from the Ottoman Empire, and Russia had to stop because the Austrian Empire didn't want to see these Christian countries ruled by Russia instead, and threatened to join in the war on Turkey's side. So it switched. And the reason it became the Crimean War was that Russia still wanted to attack Turkey, but it found it would be much better if it attacked it by sea from the Crimea, only a day's sailing away from Istanbul. And in the Crimea there was a wonderful harbour, Sebastopol, well protected by mountains, well fortified. And so it became, for that reason, the Crimean War. But it didn't stay the Crimean War, because when the British and the French decided, with a lot of opposition from their own people, to join in the war against Russia on the side of Turkey, Christian countries deciding to defend a Muslim nation against a Christian one, they decided to attack Russia in the Baltic and sent ships up and even round the top of Norway and went into the White Sea and later on into the Pacific and attacked Siberian ports, rather half-heartedly and unsuccessfully. So most of the fighting was to do with the Crimea and defending Turkey. The war itself had an official excuse that there was an argument over access to churches in Jerusalem between Catholics and Orthodox, which made the French very angry with the Russians. But the real reasons are much more obvious. Nobody wanted Russia to have more influence in Eastern Europe, especially as Eastern Europe was the source of wheat for the British working classes, and they didn't want Russia to have a stranglehold on it. So that was, I think, the main commercial reason. And the other was that Russia would then get access, if it was successful, to the Mediterranean, easy access, and that would interfere with Britain's access and France's access to their empires. The Suez Canal hadn't been built yet, but they were planning to get that access, and they didn't want Russian ships getting in the way. So those were the real reasons for the Crimean War.
You mentioned that the British were attacking not just in the Crimea. There was a story, I think, about a British attack which ended rather badly. Poor old Admiral Price. Do you just want to tell the story of Admiral Price?
Yes, this is a tragic comedy. In deciding to destroy Russian naval bases all around the Russian Empire, they got together a small fleet of French and British sailing boats with just one steamer to give it a bit of pull. And they went right past China into the wilds of eastern Siberia to Kamchatka, to the port of Petropavlovsk. And to do this, they brought out a retired captain and made him an admiral, David Price. He was not very sure of himself. It took a long time to get the fleet together, and he was late arriving, and they made a complete mess of it. The Russian Cossacks manning the Petropavlovsk were very well prepared. They knew they were coming. They heard from American whalers in the area that the fleet was on its way, and they had their guns ready. And the British and French attempted a landing. They were very optimistic. They landed not just with guns, but lots of shackles so they could take lots of prisoners. And it was a complete massacre. They lost 200 men. Admiral Price officially died of an accidental shot from his pistol when he was cleaning it. In fact, he shot himself, and even he bungled that. It took him hours to die. The Cossacks who manned the fortifications were very kind. They announced a truce, and they said, you can bring your admiral on shore and we'll bury him for you. And they buried him nicely and even put a monument up. And the British and French sailed away with just a few captives. They left behind some wounded men, and to their amazement, when they came back 6 months later, they collected them and they'd all recovered, minus a leg or two. And they took their prisoners, the few prisoners they had, and they decided to interfere with the shipping between Siberia and Alaska, which, as you may know, was Russian territory. And they didn't realize what the situation was, that Alaska and Vancouver, in what is British Columbia today, were declared neutral because neither Russia nor Britain had the forces available to fortify them or defend them. And on the way there, the British and French managed to capture one Russian ship and make all the passengers and the crew prisoners. And they sailed off to Vancouver, and they found that they had to disembark all their Russian civilians. They were priests, traders, civil servants. And the British still had about 24 Russian prisoners of war, and they couldn't think where to take them. But first they went to San Francisco, and the Russian consul in San Francisco heard about this. He had a list of all the men, and he went to an American judge, and he said it is illegal for a belligerent party like the British or the French to hold prisoners of war in a neutral country. And an American judge, Judge Norton, issued a writ, habeas corpus, demanding that the Russian prisoners should be freed. The English captain heard about this. He got the writ, and instead of replying to it, he sailed away. And offshore, he transferred all his prisoners to a French ship and another British ship. And then he sailed his captured Russian ship all the way down the coast to Cape Horn, all the way up the Atlantic to France, where they auctioned the valuable cargo. Meanwhile, those prisoners did a tour of Polynesia. They dropped off at Honolulu because one of the prisoners was an 11-year-old cadet, and they thought it was perhaps a bit wrong. The cadet said he'd rather be a prisoner of the British and go on serving in the Russian Navy. But they dropped him off at Honolulu, and they arranged with an American whaler to take him to the Siberian coast and take him back again. And then they did a 2-month tour of the Polynesian islands, and they finally got to Tahiti, which was French territory, and the Tahitian newspapers report there was a lot of music and dancing and fraternization on board, and everyone seemed extremely happy, and they were disembarked. So these Russian prisoners had 9 months in Tahiti, and they were finally shipped back to France for repatriation eventually. But that was the Pacific episode. One of the Russian prisoners was on a French boat. He was so popular with the crew, and he was such a good sailor, they persuaded him to stay on the boat. And his name was Semyon Udaloy. Everything was wonderful until 6 months later, the French decided they'd go back to Petropavlovsk and retrieve the 3 wounded men they'd left there. Poor old Semyon Udaloy was so frightened, he thought he might be landed and arrested as a traitor. Nobody quite knows what was going through his mind, but he climbed up to the top of the mast, made the sign of the cross, and jumped into the sea. That was the end of him.
Gosh, so I was going to sort of say that
It's a tragicomedy, that Pacific expedition. And Petropavlovsk, when they got there the second time, was completely deserted. They moved all the guns somewhere else, and to find their wounded men who were prisoners, they had to ask an American whaler again. A lot of American whalers all over Siberia, they knew exactly what was going on, and they had good relations with the Russians.
All these details, which happen far away from the main action, and people just, they just don't quite fit.
Well, it made the British look silly and incompetent, and so that type of history tends to be repressed.
Yes, quite. So before we talk about Crimean War prisoners, I just wondered, do you have a sense of how prisoners of war have been treated historically? I mean, I'm thinking back to things like ancient Rome, where if you were on the losing side, I guess enslaved, if you were very, very lucky, is about the size of it.
One could say that there has been progress. Generally speaking, I mean, it began with the view if we go back to classical times, let's say, that if you were taken prisoner, it was your fault, really. You'd done something wrong. Either you had failed to fight to the death, and that was no reason to treat you well, or you had carried on fighting when it's clearly hopeless to fight, and you'd caused unnecessary bloodshed. And in that case, you also deserved to die.
There's no
you couldn't win
here.
And in European history, generally speaking, wars were fought over ideologies, Catholic versus Protestant, Christian versus Muslim, and they tended to be merciless. The idea that your religious infidel didn't deserve to live. And there were some exceptions during the Crusades when Saladin, the Kurdish defender of the Levant, was very nice to French and British knights. But generally speaking, it was pretty murderous. And I think it came to an end, really, this murderous state, in about 1648, when the 30 Years' War ended. That was the last big war of Catholic versus Protestant. After that, wars tended to be about territory, about access to waterways, about access to wealth. There was no actual personal hatred involved to any great degree. And it was seen as probably a good politic to be reasonably nice to prisoners of war, because you might be friendly with that country when peace treaties were signed. And you might get reciprocal treatment, that your prisoners might be treated better if you treated their prisoners. So during the 18th century, things improved. And I must say that the Russians took the initiative in the 1820s when they had a lot of Ottoman prisoners. Nicholas I, who is a Tsar that's not popular, people think of him as a hard-hearted martinet with no imagination or mercy. But in fact, he liked order and he liked good common sense. And he instituted a principle in which prisoners of war were treated as your own soldiers. You paid them what they would have received in salary. You made sure they had accommodation and food. And generally speaking, this practice was continued. In fact, even when Napoleon invaded Russia and burnt down Moscow, there was no proper system for looking after prisoners. In fact, Napoleon moved so fast that he couldn't take prisoners with him. If he didn't kill them, he just left them to find shelter and food themselves. After the Napoleonic Wars in Russia, you found stray Frenchmen and Germans from the Grande Armée living in Russian villages with the peasants quite happily. A few were organized from Moscow and sent to Siberia. But they were treated very well, especially if you were French. A French prisoner in Russia was in great demand to teach French to the children, to practice French with the ladies of the house, and he could also teach the children swordsmanship and shooting. The French prisoners in Siberia, if they could put up with the climate, did quite well. So that was an example of humane treatment, surprisingly enough, by the Russians.
Going back to the Crimean War, when did the Allies first find themselves with really large numbers of prisoners on their hands?
Well, it began, if you mean large numbers, with hundreds. They found themselves when they had one successful expedition in the Baltic. They went up to the Åland Islands. The people who lived there are now Finnish, and they always were Finnish ethnically. But in 1854, they were part of the Russian Empire. So the big fortress, the Bombasund, had Russian officers, Russian police, and so on. But most of the soldiers, conscripts, were Finns. This wasn't very well defended because the Russians were sure that it was impossible for sailing ships to attack them. What they didn't anticipate was the British did have steamers, and steamboats are much more maneuverable, and the steamboat actually demolished the fortifications and arrested everyone they found. And the problem was that in Russia, civil servants, virtually anyone employed by the government, even students, all wore uniform.
Oh, dear.
And so they rounded everyone up, not just the soldiers and the officers, but also the local civil servants and even some Estonian fishermen, and brought them all back to Sheerness. And they then discovered they had other things to worry about. They had wives. In the Russian army, it was often a tradition that officers could take their wives with them on campaign, even mothers, sisters, and in one or two cases, governesses.
So hang on. Let me just understand. When they capture the fortress and they bundle all their prisoners on board, did they take the?
They took the wives. Yes. So they left the children behind, and the children had to find their. If they had grandparents, that was fine. If they didn't, they had to be looked after by the local orphanages. So they had this incredible confusion, and it ended up with some of the wives going to being imprisoned by the French on the west coast on an island off the River Charente, and the husbands would be in Sheerness and vice versa. So for some months, the British and French tried to sort this out, and they brought some wives back to Britain and sent some husbands back over to France. They weren't used to this. I mean, the British did have an enormous number of prisoners during the Napoleonic Wars, and they did quite well because they decided to send them as far away from the coast as they could. A lot went to Scotland, and they were given plots of land in which they could grow vegetables, they could go fishing, and they were pretty well left to their own devices.
And just for the listeners, you say the prisoners were taken to Sheerness. So where is Sheerness?
Sheerness is at the mouth of Medway, near Chatham and Rochester. It's a very Dickensian country, Rochester and so on.
And that's quite near to London, right?
Very near to London, yes. Well connected by train even then. And at first they put them in hulks, the way that the British used to put convicts in hulks before shipping them to Australia for transportation. And hulks were just decommissioned ships that had lost their masts and were rather damp and unhealthy, and they realized this. And the Russians, officers and the Finnish soldiers made a fuss about this. First of all, they said that the bread ration was inadequate, that they were used to about a kilo of bread per head per day. The British replied that that was Russian black bread, and British white bread was much more nutritious, so they didn't need nearly as much. But in the end, they gave in, and they provided ovens and flour and said you can bake it yourself on the dockyard. And then the Russians complained, and the Finns complained, that tobacco in Britain was exorbitantly expensive, very cheap in Russia. That took some negotiation before the Admiralty decided to supply tobacco. And then the money that they were promised, and the British paid the same rates to an officer as he would have got in the British Army.
So I'm sort of picturing that we've got one Russian soldier, we've got any number of POWs and governesses and what else. But anyway, so what happens to them after?
Well, they'd refurbish Lewes Jail near Brighton, and it was warm, well heated, had a good governor in charge, and they had 3 beds to a room. They lived in luxury. They were given a workshop, and the Finns turned out to be extraordinarily good wood carvers. And they were allowed to carve wooden toys, beautiful things. And there may be some in the antique shops in Brighton today. And they made a lot of money selling them to visitors to the prison would come and buy toys. And it was said they were making something like, in today's money, some of the prisoners went home with several £1,000s. And there were complaints, a letter to the Times. I don't know how many letters the Times actually got, but they printed one complaining that orphans and widows of soldiers fighting in the Crimea had very little money to live on, was starving and living in the cold, while their menfolk were suffering and dying of disease, and yet these prisoners were living a life of luxury. This is often a complaint, in fact, when British officers were in Russian hands and living in hotels and going to the opera and mixing with ballet dancers. They were told when they got back to the Crimea that you better not ask for back pay because your fellow officers are so furious at the life of luxury you've been having in Russia.
Well, it did. I mean, it did sound rather fun if you were I mean, it sounds like you could maybe make a decent living if you were, a Finnish soldier and skilled at carving toys. But the officers seemed to do even better.
They did even better, yes. Well, they were very well looked after. There was another peculiar thing about the Crimean War, and I think about other wars in the 19th century, that embassies were certainly, of your enemy embassies were closed down, but the chaplain was left there. And the chaplain's job was to look after prisoners of war. And in England, there was a Reverend Yevgeny Popov. And Yevgeny Popov was very highly placed. He'd been a personal chaplain to the Tsar's sister, who was Queen of the Netherlands. He spoke French and English. He belonged to a London club. And this is the other extraordinary thing. London clubs continued taking Russian newspapers throughout the war and used to take newspapers for the Russian officers to read. He was subsidized not just by the Russian embassy, but by a Russian prince who we might want to talk about later, who was extraordinary in what he did. He did for Russian prisoners of war what Florence Nightingale did for the wounded and the sick.
Mm. So one thing I wasn't quite clear about is, are Russian officers kept locked up? Are they released sometimes? Are they out on some sort of parole system? How are they treated?
Generally speaking, there was a parole system. The ones in Lewis were told they could go anywhere they liked as long as they didn't go more than 10 miles from Lewis. And they were invited by all the local gentry to shooting parties. In the newspapers you find that there was a hare coursing and the Russian officers were all invited. Sometimes there's one report which shows that some of the ordinary local population weren't so happy about that. I think if you had a brother fighting in the Crimea and you saw a Russian officer striding down the street, because there's one case where a Russian was abused in the street by a man. The man was brought up to the magistrates and fined, and he was told by the magistrate, these Russians are not here of their own free will, they must be treated with respect. So that was the attitude. Then most Russians ended up in Plymouth, because Plymouth had a naval prison. They were kept up, but they were taken for walks, country walks like schoolboys, in the hills round Plymouth. They had a very kind governor, Lieutenant Harry Vetch. He used to turn up at their concerts and their church services too. Reverend Popov would come down there and he'd hold services and bring papers and so on. And on the Tsar's birthday, they were given a dinner at one of the great hotels in Exeter, and the amount of money per head was, in those days, 10 shillings, which in today's money is about 50 pounds. And they had port, they had sherry, they had brandy, and the prison governor turned up too and was present during the toasts to the Tsar. So it was very liberal. There was a local lord and lady who had a castle, and they invited the Russian officers there. So in Plymouth it wasn't bad either, and Lieutenant Vetch used to send desserts from his own kitchen to any soldiers who were feeling a bit ill.
Yes.
When the war ended and all the prisoners were repatriated, there were letters of thanks from the officers to the prison governor for his kindness and condolences on the death of his wife, and the same at Lewis. There was an interview with a journalist, Russian-speaking journalist, who came over from Australia, I think, and he asked the prisoners how they were getting on, how they felt. And one Russian soldier said, "I don't feel that I'm a prisoner. I feel I am the guest of a charitable and generous nation."
Oh, good.
And the Russian officer who was supervising this conversation was clearly very annoyed.
Well, good for us British, but but I suppose also good for the Russians because as you said earlier, they behaved extremely well there.
Yes.
I mean, I was interested. Well, two questions, which I suppose are slightly related. I mean, one is, did anyone try to escape? And the other is, did anyone say, well, it's lovely here, I'm going to stay on?
In Britain, there were 2 escapes, and the police refused to investigate. They said it is not a crime to escape from a prisoner of war camp. It's not a prison, if nothing's been stolen. Nobody's quite sure what happened, but 2 Russian prisoners of war turned up in Hamburg on a ship from Newcastle, so it's probably them. In France, things are rather stricter. They are better, more supervised.
I suppose it's easier to escape from France because...
Well, it wasn't easy if you were a soldier. The officers didn't want to escape because they all spoke French. They were quite happy. And after an initial point in air, they were given a choice of anywhere they wanted to live except Paris or a military city or a border city. And most of them chose to live on the Loire. They had one general, General Badisco, a Russian general, and he had his wife, his cook, a couple of servants, and a whole entourage. And so most of the other French officers decided they'd live on the Loire, and they had enough money and they got extra money from Prince Davidov from the Russian embassy in Vienna. But there was one extraordinary escape from France. There was an ordinary soldier, and he saved up his pay. It wasn't very much, but he bought second-hand French workman's clothing and buried it under a tree. And then at Easter, when there was no roll call, no work, he went and buried his uniform and put on this clothing. Then he pretended to be a deaf mute and decided that Russia must be east, and he walked east. He was totally illiterate. He didn't speak a word of French. He begged, and in France, when you were picked up for begging, at least then, it was the custom in every department to put you on a cart and move you to the next department, like the homeless in a British county, to get you to the next county. He decided that when he heard a different language spoken, he would hand himself in. And after a while, he did hear a different language spoken, so he handed himself in. He found he was in Belgium, and he said he was a Russian prisoner. They took him to the Russian consulate, and then he went to Brussels and was given a train ticket to Warsaw. And so he got back to Russia and was congratulated by the Tsar.
Nice. Just talking a bit about the French then, tell me about this, is it Prince Demidov? Am I pronouncing that right?
This was an extraordinary man, Anatole Davidov. He was against the Crimean War. The Tsar disliked him intensely for personal reasons because he was rather liberal in his attitudes. But he was married to Napoleon's niece, Matilda. Matilda was fairly wild, and Prince Davidov was fairly liberal in his attitudes to women. So they didn't get on very well. And Matilda on her mother's side, was related to the Tsar. And Davidov smoothed his way by contributing 1 million rubles, which is a lot of money, to the Crimean War. But he spent much more than 1 million on maintaining prisoners of war. And as a French citizen and a Russian citizen, and married to Napoleon's third cousin, he had pretty well free access to everywhere. He didn't come to Britain, but he had an agent in Britain. And he had constant reports on how people were and what they needed and what medicines, newspapers, tobacco. All the problems were sorted out through him and his generosity. In the Ottoman Empire, he had a banker friend who sorted things out for him. And he solved the problem for Russian prisoners in the Ottoman Empire was that the Ottoman Empire was the only place where there was real hostility to Russian prisoners. And they had to be kept locked up. They couldn't have them walking the streets in Istanbul because they'd be lynched. And Davidov organized a transfer of all the Russian prisoners in the Ottoman Empire to the 3 islands just off Istanbul, Büyükada and Kinaliada and so on, which are now tourist places. But in those days, they were virtually entirely Greek. Each one had a Greek monastery. And the Greeks were very happy to look after their fellow Orthodox Russians. They nursed them, they fed them. So the prisoners of war were taken out of Ottoman hands, taken to these Greek islands, and then they were shipped to France, to Toulon, and they were taken care of.
Ah, it is interesting. This man, I gather he was quite violent to Matilda, and he was certainly, regularly unfaithful. So
well, I think she was regularly unfaithful. And I think all these divorce cases, I think you take with a grain of salt each side's complaints.
I gather that in the end, the Tsar intervened in the marriage, and I don't know, ended up paying Matilda a pension or something.
She got a lot of money off Davidov. She got a lot of money off the Tsar. I think you don't have to worry about
Much to be said on all sides, as my father used to say.
When you look at Davidov's own generosity, the way that he left his entire fortune to support veterans from the Crimean War when he died in 1870, he was quite a good man, really.
So I guess because France and Britain and the Ottomans were ultimately on the winning side, I mean, I guess they had fewer men taken prisoner. But I think you mentioned this guy who, the captain of HMS Tiger.
Oh, there were quite a few. The Russians had quite a few prisoners to take care of. The first one was a naval British steamer which got stranded on the rocks as it was firing at the defences around Odessa. And they got themselves so stuck they couldn't fire back when the Russians started attacking them. Unfortunately, it was a time in which there was a plague epidemic, and the Russians were a bit nervous about taking them prisoner. And so they had to exchange messages on sword tips to avoid physical contact. But after 3 weeks quarantine, they decided the British were not carrying plague, and suddenly things became extraordinarily friendly. And the governor of Odessa spoke beautiful English, and he took them to the opera, and he made sure they all looked after. They had hospitality all round, and they came to some agreements, which were very important. One agreement was they would stop killing each other's wounded. The early days of the battles in the Crimea, the wounded were bayoneted to death.
But now, when you say that happened, do you mean that they were, when you saw somebody wounded and the battle was still going on, or were they?
Yeah, well, either that, or when after the battle was over, we went and finished them off.
Gosh.
So you didn't have the bother of looking after them. Well, it was a bother because we had to get them either all the way back across the sea to Scutari opposite Istanbul, or you had to get them across roadless wastes of Crimea and the Ukraine.
Right.
And they came to an agreement that this would stop. And afterwards, you find memos of other officers, or one officer who was nearly killed by a shot, and then he's wounded. And a Greek came and tried to bayonet him, and a Pole in the Russian army pulled the Greek off and said, "You're not allowed to do this anymore."
Yeah.
The problem for prisoners, British prisoners and French prisoners taken by the Russians, was the first month, because there were no roads, effectively. Russia has always suffered, and to this day suffers from, not only had they not built a railway further south than Moscow, they hadn't built any roads, or many roads. And so if you were an officer, they put you on a Russian wagon where the only springing was birch poles, one end to the other, and you lay on the hay and hoped you could survive. And if you were not an officer, you walked. Your baggage went on a wagon. It was better in winter because then you could travel up the river on the ice, which is reasonably smooth. But in other seasons, it's a nightmare. They found, however, the prisoners, at least they were often offered a bed for the night by local gentry, new settlers who built villas and estates there. And the local Crimean Tatars had this traditional Muslim hospitality, and they didn't care whether you were a prisoner or a Russian soldier. They would come out, give you food and medicine and so on. And there was a peculiar fact in the Crimea that the nephew of the last Crimean Khan, who'd been expelled by Russia and then executed by the Sultan of Turkey, he'd been rescued by a missionary, taken to Scotland, brought up in Scotland to be a missionary, and he'd married, to the horror of her father, a Scottish girl, and brought her back to Crimea. And he was the only Protestant, as far as I know, in the Crimea, and so was she. And he died, but his widow continued and his son continued, and they were protected by both sides. This Anne Nelson was protected by the British and by the Russians, so they had a free hand in dealing with prisoners and with soldiers, deserters even. They were untouchable. So there was a sort of Tatar hospitality to the unfortunate.
Well, I gather Royer, the captain of the Tiger, I don't know if he wrote a letter to the Times of what he did, but...
He did a thing which was highly disapproved of. He published a book about English officers in the Crimea, and he dedicated to our barbarous allies and our civilized enemies,
Oh, dear.
which made him very unpopular with his fellow officers, but very popular with the Russians. And he finally got to St. Petersburg, and he was taken to meet members of the Tsar's family in St. Petersburg, and they explained to him that he couldn't really wear his sword as a prisoner of war, but they would post it back to his family, and they did. It was posted via Warsaw and Vienna, got to London.
It's extraordinary because the war itself is such a bloody affair and people die both in the battles and horribly of disease. And yet
Yes.
this sort of gentlemanly...
It is extraordinary. Being a prisoner of war is really recuperation from the battle. Mind you, when you look at the statistics, and the French lost, they estimate, about 100,000 men, but only 25,000 in battle. All the rest died of disease, and the same proportion in Britain. One of the things that made the public more angry with their own side than with the enemy was the fact that their own side, by failing logistics and medical services, killed far more of the men than the enemy ever could. There was one thing about the Russians' attitude to prisoners which I thought was highly intelligent and foresighted, which was the Russians realized that the Ottoman Empire was not purely Turkish. It was a mixture of various minorities.
Yeah.
Obviously, they were interested in the Christian ones. They'd supported Greek independence, but they also captured some Egyptian officers. One of the first things they captured was a ferry, ferrying arms from Anatolia to the Crimea. It was captured by a Russian ferry, ferrying arms from a Russian port to the Crimea. And it had a British captain, because it was a steam ferry, needed an engineer in charge, and it had Egyptian officers. And the British engineer was taken to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he was offered a job in the Russian Navy. He politely said, "I won't decline, but I must go back to London first and settle my family." And they said, "Okay, and see you later." And of course, he never returned. But the Egyptian officers were treated to everything. They were shown the palaces. They were shown the train, the nice new shiny train which the Americans had built to St. Petersburg. They didn't like the picture galleries because there were women with bare shoulders there, but they liked everything else. And they were repatriated. They weren't even asked not to fight again.
Mm.
And it might explain why Egypt was so fond of Russia for the next 100 years. Because when the British took Egypt over in 1882, because they wanted to control the Suez Canal, a group of Egyptian officers went to see the Russian consul and said, "If you're ever thinking of attacking London, the Egyptian Navy will be with you."
Not for much longer if the British have anything to do with it.
Yes, they wouldn't have expected that. And the other nation which the Russians took advantage of was the Kurds.
Right.
The Kurds in the army were captured by the Russians, there were a group of them, 100 or so, and they were taken to a small town in western Russia. They were put to work harvesting in the fields, and they harvested the fields 3 times faster than Russian peasants could, and so the landowners decided to pay them a big premium, and they were extremely well paid, and they used the money to go to the market and buy themselves some cloth and sew themselves some magnificent uniforms with Kurdish fezzes and Kurdish trousers and so on. And they were given a house in this little town of Roslav, and when autumn came, their labour wasn't required. They would parade up and down the town, and they would help women carry their buckets of water from the town pump to their houses. They would go to the market, buy food, and they would distribute it to all the beggars. And they said, Kurds never refuse a beggar. And they became really popular when the town caught fire. It was a wooden town. Mm. And the Kurds took felt, soaked it in water, and climbed all over the roofs of houses to stop them catching fire. When the cathedral started burning, the Kurds took off their shoes, took off their fezzes, went into the cathedral and saved all the icons, took them to a safe place. The newspaper wrote about them and said, "Look at our prisoners of war. Look at the British with their arrogance and their drunkenness and their self-assurance, who they're supposed to be civilized. Compare them to the hard-working Kurds who pray 5 times a day. Who do you think are the most civilized?" So that was in one of the leading Russian newspapers.
Gosh, so the British are, oh well.
The British came in for a very bad press in that particular newspaper.
British hooliganism was alive and well even.
On the other hand, there was an example where the British were very, very much appreciated, and that was in the town of Voronezh, where a group of British sailors ended up. And they were very pleased because they found the money that they were given to buy food was enough to buy an entire sheep's pluck and all the bread they could eat and all the vodka they could drink. And then they were asked in spring if they could organize a ferry service, because the trouble with the city of Voronezh was that to get from the prosperous suburbs to work in the city, you had to cross the river. In winter it was frozen, that was all right. In summer and autumn, there was a pontoon bridge which you could walk across. But in spring, with the floods, the bridge wouldn't hold. And they didn't have any oarsmen strong enough to run a ferry service. So these British sailors ran a ferry service across all spring, from April to June, and they were paid very highly. And some of the senior civil servants gave them a silver ruble each time, which is equivalent to about £20 in today's money.
Extraordinary stories.
Yes.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about a little bit was, it very much surprised me because there was the fortress of Kars, which was besieged. And although you would think Kars is in Turkey or in Ottoman hands anyway, nonetheless, there were a huge number of British officers there.
There were British senior officers and advisors, and they were horrified at the way the Ottomans were conducting this war. It's utterly corrupt. The problem with the Turkish Ottoman army was the very top officers, the pashas, received enormous sums of money, and the men, they just spent all the money they were supposed to spend on food. So the Ottoman army was actually starving, and even the British advisors ended up eating their own horses because there was no food. And Kars, as I found when I was in that area, is in winter extremely cold, much colder than Russia, -40.
And where exactly is Kars?
Kars is near what is now the Georgian and Armenian border. It's high up near Mount Ararat. It's not a place anyone wants to be sent to. Eventually, the Ottoman army was on the brink of, they were dying of starvation, and it surrendered. And the Russian general, Muravyov, he was quite a generous man, and so when the prisoners all surrendered, he organized a great big dinner, a beef stew. And if you know the stories, what happened to prisoners in Auschwitz when they were suddenly fed, that was the fatal thing to do. And it's thought that 1,500 people died with that dinner.
Good God.
And the remainders then had to be transported. Of course, they had to go through the lower Caucasus on foot. Officers provided with a carriage, but the problem was the snow was too deep for a carriage, but not deep enough for sledges. And sometimes the horses couldn't manage in the mountains. They had to get oxen to pull the carriages. Absolute nightmare till they got across the Caucasus. And by the time they got across the Caucasus, they found that the peace treaty was being signed. So they couldn't go on into central Russia. They had to turn left and go west towards Odessa to be repatriated. And prisoners, if you were caught in eastern Turkey, you were in the hands of what were called the Bashibuzuks, who are bandits, basically. It means rotten heads. Mm. And the Bashibuzuks, the only thing they could think of doing with a prisoner was to sell him to anyone who would buy him, either to someone who wanted him as a slave or to the enemy who wanted him back. So it was not a good place to fight. And that was the biggest bunch of prisoners. But if they didn't die on the march home, their war was over. At least they got repatriated to Istanbul, or in the case of the few British officers, to Britain. But it was a traumatic experience, and the people who wrote about their experience in Kars clearly never recovered from it.
Got it. Okay, so that's a slightly downbeat ending.
Well, I got one upbeat ending, actually.
Okay, please.
And this is unique in history. I don't think it's even happened today. It was at the Treaty of Paris. They foresaw something which we didn't foresee in 1945, when an awful lot of prisoners of war had to be returned to their home countries. It's one thing awful being a prisoner of war during the war. The other awful thing is to be returned to a home country that suspects you of being a traitor, particularly Russia. And ever since the 17th century, returned prisoners of war to Russia have been suspected of being spies, traitors, enemy agents, and so on.
Yeah.
And they've often been killed right up to Stalin's day. And today, if you come back from the Ukrainian as a returned Russian prisoner, you often wish you hadn't been. And the declaration was issued by the POWs. Extraordinary in the history of prisoners of war. I don't think we've ever done anything better. Their Majesties, the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the Emperor of the French, the Emperor of all the Russias, the King of Sardinia, and the Sultan, grant a full and entire amnesty to those of their subjects who may have been compromised by any participation whatsoever in the events of the war in favor of the cause of the enemy. It is expressly understood such amnesty shall extend to the subjects of each of the belligerent parties who may have continued during the war to be employed in the service of one of the other belligerents. And this affected Poles. It even affected Cossacks, because there was a whole group of Cossacks, the Nekrasovцы, who fled Russia 100 years earlier and sought protection from the Ottomans because they were old believers and they were being religiously persecuted. And they were captured, some of them by the Russians, and they weren't punished. They were offered residence in Russia if they agreed to be rebaptized into the Reformed Church, and most of them refused, and they were sent back to the Ottoman Empire.
Huh.
Now, I don't think that happened. If you look at what happened in 1945 when prisoners of war in the Russian army, and even Russian speakers who were not citizens of the Soviet Union, but would have been citizens of the Russian Empire before, were sent back to Russia to be executed, sent to the Gulag, and never given a chance of a normal life. So that was something at the end of the Crimean War, which was more progressive than anything we have today.
Okay, well, look, I think we're going to have to leave it there. So in the next episode, we're going to be going back further in time into the history of the Crimea, and we're going to, I think, start with the Mongols of the Golden Horde. But in the meantime, Professor Donald Rayfield, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.